The courtroom was dead silent. Every breath, every shuffle, every heartbeat echoed against the marble walls. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, firm posture, eyes burning with defiance, lips trembling not out of fear, but out of control. Across from her sat Judge Ruth Bader, a name that carried weight heavier than law itself. Known for her razor-sharp reasoning and impossible calm, she'd faced senators, scholars, and criminals, but never someone like Jasmine. The case? A social rights appeal gone viral. A woman challenging not just a verdict, but the system that built it. Jasmine had been wronged. And she was not going to whisper her truth, she was going to roar it. "Ms. Crockett," the judge said, her voice like glass cutting through fog, "you stand before this court accused of defamation, obstruction, and disorderly conduct during a federal hearing. Do you wish to make an opening statement?" Jasmine raised her chin. "Yes, Your Honor. I do." The cameras rolled. Reporters leaned in. Even the bailiff paused. Jasmine took one deep breath, the kind you take before walking through fire, and spoke. "I didn't come here to defend myself. I came here to defend the truth that this court keeps burying." The gallery murmured. Ruth's expression didn't change, but her fingers gripped the gavel tighter. "Order," she said quietly. But Jasmine didn't stop. "Order." Jasmine shot back. How can there be order when justice has already been sold? That line, those 11 words, exploded across social media that afternoon. Within minutes, the courtroom was trending. Hashtag Justice vs. System. Hashtag Crockett vs. Bader. But inside those four walls, there was no hashtag strong enough to contain the tension. Judge Ruth leaned forward. "Ms. Crockett, this isn't a theater. You will address the court respectfully." "And the court will listen respectfully," Jasmine replied, her voice shaking but clear. Even the stenographer's fingers paused mid-keystroke. Ruth sighed. "You were a law student once, weren't you?" "I still am," Jasmine answered. "Except now, I study what the law refuses to teach, humanity." That hit hard. Ruth glanced at her notes, then back at Jasmine, a long, piercing look that felt like judgment itself. "Proceed," the judge finally said. Jasmine nodded. "Thank you." And she began, not with evidence, but with a story. She talked about her father, a man wrongfully imprisoned when she was 10. A man who taught her that truth was a weapon sharper than any verdict. A man who died waiting for an appeal that never came. "So no, Your Honor," Jasmine said, voice breaking. "I won't stand here and apologize for raising my voice. I inherited this fight." The gallery went still. Judge Ruth shifted in her seat. Something flickered in her eyes. Memory, maybe even guilt. But she masked it quickly. "Ms. Crockett, emotional testimony won't overturn facts." Jasmine smiled, not mockingly, but with quiet power. "Then maybe your facts need re-examining." And for the first time in years, Ruth didn't know how to respond. The gavel struck once, sharp, final. "Recess for 10 minutes, she ordered. As Ruth left the bench, Jasmine stood alone at the center of the room, cameras flashing, whispers growing. She knew she had cracked something. Not the case yet, but the surface of the truth. And when Ruth returned, Jasmine would be ready to shatter the rest. The sound of the gavel still echoed when the doors opened again. Judge Ruth Bader returned, her black robe flowing like a shadow that carried history and authority. The crowd rose, the murmurs died, and silence reclaimed its throne. "Court is back in session," Ruth said, her voice cutting clean through the air. Jasmine stood tall. The world was watching. This wasn't just another trial. It was a showdown of conviction. "Ruth, Ms. Crockett, before we proceed, I advise you to remember, this court operates on evidence, not emotion." "Jasmine, then allow me to present both, Your Honor. Because the evidence is emotional when it's real." A hush fell. The reporters looked at each other. Even the security officer raised an eyebrow. Ruth leaned forward slightly. "You're walking on thin ice." Jasmine smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time someone tested how deep this ice goes." The judge motioned. "Proceed with your statement." Jasmine reached for a folder, thick, worn, full of papers marked with yellow highlights and sticky notes. "These," she said, lifting the stack, "are internal reports, sealed for years. Each one marked closed due to insufficient grounds. But each one hides the same pattern: names erased, witnesses silenced, and justice denied. She walked slowly toward the center. The crowd leaned forward. "These are not my words, Your Honor. These are yours. Your signature closes each one of them." Ruth's eyes lifted sharply. "You are implying misconduct in my courtroom." "I'm not implying," Jasmine replied. "I'm revealing." "Ms. Crockett, you talk about the next generation," Ruth said finally. "Then answer me this. What example are you setting by attacking a judge on national television?" Jasmine straightened her papers. "An example of courage, Your Honor. Because if standing for truth is seen as an attack, then maybe the system's too fragile to stand at all." The courtroom erupted. Applause burst before the bailiff could shout order. Ruth's gavel slammed. "Order!" The echo was louder than before. The walls trembled. The applause stopped. "Ms. Crockett," Ruth said coldly, "you are testing my patience." "Then maybe patience isn't what justice needs," Jasmine replied, her voice low but fierce. "Maybe it needs honesty." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "You think you're brave, but arrogance doesn't rewrite law." "And fear doesn't protect it either," Jasmine answered. The gavel struck again. Hard. Enough. But Jasmine didn't move. Didn't blink. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "you can strike your gavel 100 times. But if you keep ignoring what's broken, one day that sound won't command respect, it'll command revolt." That was it. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. Even the air seemed scared to move. Judge Ruth froze, her lips parted slightly. Not in anger, but in realization. Because deep down, she knew Jasmine wasn't wrong. Ruth looked away, scanning the gallery. "We'll resume tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." The gavel hit one last time, not in dominance, but in surrender. Jasmine gathered her papers, eyes wet but unbroken. As she turned to leave, Ruth's voice stopped her. "Ms. Crockett." Jasmine looked back. The judge's tone softened, almost human. "Bring your evidence tomorrow. All of it." Jasmine nodded slowly. "I already did, Your Honor. You just didn't want to see it." And with that, she walked out, leaving a silence that felt heavier than any verdict. The morning light poured through the courthouse windows like judgment itself. Cameras lined the steps outside. Every news anchor in the country had their microphones ready. Hashtags had turned into headlines. Hashtag Crockett vs. Bader wasn't just trending. It had become the story. Inside, Judge Ruth Bader entered her courtroom with a stillness that carried weight. The same crowd from yesterday returned, but now the air was electric. People knew something big was about to break. At the plaintiff's table stood Jasmine Crockett, calm, centered, unflinching. Her briefcase rested beside her, but what caught everyone's attention was the thick brown folder in her hands. The one labeled Confidential, Internal Records. Ruth adjusted her glasses. "Ms. Crockett, I hope you've come prepared to present actual evidence, not just accusations." Jasmine met her eyes. "Evidence is all I've ever had, Your Honor. The question is whether this court will finally see it." The court clerk stepped forward. "All rise." Everyone obeyed. Ruth took a seat, and the gavel fell. "Proceed." Jasmine took a breath, then walked toward the center. She set the folder down on the wooden podium and opened it slowly, each page filled with names, signatures, and suppressed complaints. "These," she began, "are case files from your own district, cases dismissed under insufficient grounds. But the evidence within these pages proves otherwise." She pulled the first page. Case 2085, Anderson versus Bellman. Dismissed 3 years ago. The complainant provided video proof of harassment. Still marked invalid. Why? Ruth frowned. "You are aware those decisions were based on the law, not my personal opinion." "Then let's talk about your law, Your Honor," Jasmine said sharply, flipping another page. "Each dismissal required judicial approval. Each approval carries your initials." She pointed at the corner of the page. "RB." Ruth shifted in her chair, eyes narrowing. "Are you accusing me of corruption?" Jasmine's tone hardened. "I'm accusing the system of protecting power, and you of letting it happen." The crowd gasped. Someone dropped their pen. Ruth slammed her gavel. "Ms. Crockett, you're treading dangerously close to defamation." "Truth doesn't defame," Jasmine snapped. "It exposes." She held up another file. Case 2091, Lewis versus State. A woman reported abuse, Your Honor. She begged for protection, but her case was buried under pending review. That review never happened. Ruth's voice lowered. Do you know why that review didn't happen? Because the department failed to verify key evidence. Jasmine shook her head. No, because the department was told not to, and the order came from someone above their pay grade. Her voice dropped to a whisper that still carried across the room. From your chambers. Gasps. Murmurs. The bailiff moved closer, sensing a storm brewing. Ruth leaned forward, her expression caught between fury and disbelief. You think I issued such an order? I don't think, Your Honor, Jasmine said, lifting another document. I know. She turned the paper toward the judge, the signature unmistakable. Ruth Bader's initials. Dated 2 weeks after the complaint. Ruth's eyes flickered. For the first time, her composure cracked. The reporters were already sending updates. Cameras zoomed in. Every whisper became a headline. Ruth took a deep breath. Ms. Crockett, this evidence is circumstantial. It proves nothing without full context. A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Even Ruth froze. The initials, her initials, echoed like a bell tolling the end of credibility. Ruth spoke slowly. That is not me. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. Maybe. But it's registered under your late husband's name, Your Honor. And the transactions began 6 months before his passing, right when these cases were being closed. Silence. Real, suffocating silence. Ruth blinked once, twice, then leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if trying to find air. Finally, she spoke. Do you know what you're doing, Ms. Crockett? You're burning the institution you claim to protect. No, Jasmine replied softly. I'm reminding it that justice isn't about protecting walls. It's about protecting people. Ruth looked down at her hands, steady on the surface, trembling underneath. For the first time, her voice wasn't commanding. It was tired. Human. You have no idea what those files represent, she said quietly. How much I've sacrificed to keep this system from collapsing. Then maybe it deserves to, Jasmine said. Because if truth collapses it, it wasn't justice, it was theater. That line landed like thunder. The crowd couldn't contain themselves anymore. A wave of emotion, gasps, camera flashes. Ruth pounded her gavel. Order. I said order. But her voice cracked mid-sentence. The court was no longer under her control. It belonged to the truth now. Ruth rose from her seat. We'll take a recess. Jasmine spoke before she could leave. There's one more thing, Your Honor. Ruth turned, her eyes weary but curious. This isn't just about these files, Jasmine said, sliding one last document forward. It's about what comes next. Because one of these cases, one that vanished before trial, involves someone from your own family. Ruth froze. My family, she repeated. Jasmine nodded. Your niece, Your Honor. The case never reached court. It was buried under your oversight. The gavel dropped from Ruth's hand, clattering on the floor. Reporters leapt from their seats. Cameras zoomed in. Jasmine whispered, Now the country knows what you didn't want them to see. The courtroom went silent once more, but this time, it wasn't because of fear. It was because, for the first time, justice felt real. And Ruth Bader knew it. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing in the whispers that still echoed like a haunting refrain. The bailiff's voice had gone hoarse shouting for order, but the chaos had already spilled into the hallways, into the media, into every feed and phone screen in the country. Inside chambers, Judge Ruth Bader sat alone. Her robe was folded neatly on the table beside her, as though she had quietly resigned from its weight for a moment. The same gavel that once silenced rooms now looked like a relic of power, too heavy to hold. She looked down at her trembling hands and murmured, "B Consulting, how did they even?" The door creaked open. Jasmine Crockett stepped in, not waiting for permission. "You shouldn't be here," Ruth said without looking up. "I'm not here as a lawyer," Jasmine said quietly. "I'm here as someone who still believes in what this court could be, if it wasn't afraid of itself." Ruth finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes had lost the sharp edge of authority. In its place, exhaustion. "Do you think this is easy? To sit on this bench, To decide who walks free and who never sees the sun again? You think this robe comes without ghosts? I never said it was easy, Jasmine replied, walking closer. But the moment we use hard as an excuse to ignore truth, we stop being judges, we become performers. The line hung in the air like a verdict. Ruth rose slowly and walked to the window. Outside, protesters were already gathering, some holding signs with Jasmine's face, others with Ruth's. You see that? Ruth said softly. They don't want justice. They want spectacle. You've given them a show. Jasmine's voice hardened. No, you did. I just turned on the lights. Ruth's reflection in the glass was almost ghostly. Do you know what it's like to have your legacy questioned after 40 years of service? To be remembered not for what you built, but for one headline. Jasmine took a breath. Legacy isn't built on silence, your honor. It's built on what you do when silence is no longer an option. Ruth turned around. You think I've never challenged the system? I bled for it. I spent decades fighting for the very fairness you accuse me of destroying. But you're naive, Ms. Crockett. You don't know what it's like when truth burns everything you love. Then let it burn, Jasmine said. Because maybe from the ashes, something honest will grow. Ruth's lip trembled for a second, almost unnoticeably, and then she stepped closer, her eyes locked on Jasmine's. You remind me of myself, she said quietly. Before the compromises, before the press, before politics swallowed principle. I used to be like you. Idealistic. Unyielding. Then what changed? Jasmine asked. Ruth exhaled. Reality. She walked back to her chair and sat down heavily. You expose corruption, fine. But do you think the people funding this courthouse, these very lights, these salaries, are saints? You pull one thread, the whole cloth unravels. Jasmine didn't hesitate. Then unravel it. Ruth's gaze was sharp again, though it glimmered with a trace of sorrow. And when the cloth is gone, what do you wear? What will you wrap around your cause when the entire system lies naked and cold? Jasmine's silence was her only answer. Outside, the chants were getting louder. Justice for the truth. Crockett speaks. Resign, Ruth. The courthouse shook with every syllable. Ruth stood again, staring at the door as if beyond it lay her own execution. Do you think they'll stop at me? She asked quietly. No. They'll come for you next, Jasmine. The same crowd that cheers you today will crucify you tomorrow. I'm ready for that, Jasmine said, her voice steady. Because at least I'll know I didn't stand in silence. Ruth smiled faintly. Courage and martyrdom are distant cousins, Ms. Crockett. And you'll learn that when you've buried enough ideals. She reached for her robe and slipped it back on. Court resumes in 5 minutes. Jasmine blinked. You're still taking the bench. Ruth looked at her coldly. I never stopped being the judge. When the courtroom doors reopened, the crowd surged forward. Cameras flashed. Ruth took her seat again, her gavel striking once, and silence fell instantly. Before we continue, she began, I wish to address the allegations brought against this court. Every reporter leaned in. Ruth continued, voice calm, almost too calm. The documents presented today are serious. I will personally request a federal investigation into their contents. Until then, no further speculation will be tolerated in this courtroom. The crowd erupted in whispers. Jasmine stood, jaw tight. Your Honor, she interjected. If this court refuses to act today, then it continues to shelter. Ruth cut her off sharply. This is not your press conference, Ms. Crockett. It's a trial. And in a trial, evidence speaks louder than outrage. Jasmine's fists clenched. Then let it speak. Ruth's eyes darkened. Be careful what you demand, Ms. Crockett. You might not survive the echo. She leaned back, folding her hands. Call your next witness. Jasmine hesitated, looking down at her file. The next witness is me. Gasps rippled across the courtroom again. Ruth frowned. Excuse me. I have first-hand testimony, Jasmine said, about how the system silenced victims, and how one of those victims was almost me. A heavy silence fell. Even Ruth didn't interrupt. Jasmine stepped to the stand. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the oath book. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "Proceed," Ruth said softly. Jasmine looked around the courtroom, every seat filled, every camera watching. Then she began. "Years ago," she said, "I was just another intern in this courthouse. Bright-eyed, foolish. I believed in justice. Until one day, a case came across my desk, a woman's life on paper, reduced to evidence tags and signatures. She begged for protection from someone powerful, and I thought would help her. Instead, the file disappeared. The woman disappeared." The courtroom was silent. Ruth's fingers gripped her bench. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that I tried to reopen her case. I sent the paperwork. I followed the rules. And then I got a call from Chambers." Ruth's eyes widened. "My Chambers?" Jasmine nodded. "A senior clerk. He told me to stop digging, said if I cared about my future, I'd forget the woman's name." Ruth's face paled. "Who told you that?" "I never knew." The voice was calm, but it carried authority. Jasmine's eyes met hers. "And that same voice signed off the closure 2 days later, with your initials." The audience gasped. Ruth leaned back, as if hit by an invisible wave. "Are you saying—" "I silenced you," she whispered. "I'm saying the system did. And maybe you didn't stop it." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes, though she fought to hide them. "You have no proof." "I don't need proof," Jasmine said, "because the truth doesn't live in paper. It lives in memory, and mine hasn't forgotten." A reporter's flash went off. The gavel slammed. "Order." Ruth's voice cracked, but as the noise settled, something changed in her expression. A flicker of doubt. A glimmer of guilt. Maybe, just maybe, Jasmine wasn't wrong. As the session ended, Ruth stayed seated long after everyone had left. The crowd outside chanted Jasmine's name, but she sat in silence, staring at the same folder that once gave her power. She whispered, barely audible, "Have I become the thing I once fought?" The following morning, Washington buzzed like a hornet's nest. Every channel ran the same footage. Jasmine's trembling oath, Ruth's haunted silence. Commentators called it the trial that broke the bench. Hashtags trended. Protesters camped outside the courthouse overnight. By sunrise, the city looked divided. Justice versus legacy, truth versus order. Inside, Ruth Bader sat alone in her chambers, her reflection faint in the morning glass. She hadn't slept. Her robe hung on the chair, untouched. On her desk lay an envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with wax. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. It was hers. But from years ago. She tore it open. Inside was a note, written to herself, decades earlier. "If ever your heart grows quieter than your conscience, step down." Her hand trembled as she folded it back. A lifetime ago, she'd written that during her first case, when justice had meant everything. Somewhere along the way, she'd traded purity for practicality, truth for survival. The bailiff's knock came at 9 o'clock sharp. "Court is ready, Your Honor." Ruth nodded faintly. "So am I." When she stepped into the courtroom, a wave of flashes blinded her. Cameras, reporters, faces. The air smelled like tension and old wood. Jasmine was already there, standing at her table, eyes unwavering. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood as Ruth took her seat. "Be seated." Her voice carried a strange calm, not authority, not fear. Something else. Resignation. Jasmine approached the stand, files in hand. "Your Honor, I have one final motion before this court. A motion to unseal all suppressed cases tied to the RB consulting funds." Ruth looked down at her gavel. The courtroom went utterly still. "Granted," she said quietly. Gasps. Cameras clicked. Even Jasmine froze for a second. "You're granting it?" "Yes." Ruth's tone was flat, controlled. "Every sealed case, every buried name. Let them surface." "But Your Honor, that could implicate." "I'm aware." Ruth's eyes met Jasmine's. Let truth implicate whoever it must. The courtroom exploded into noise, reporters whispering, people rising from their seats, the prosecutor scrambling to object. Ruth banged the gavel once, sharply. "Sit down." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Ruth turned to Jasmine. "You wanted honesty? You'll have it. But remember, once truth walks in, control walks out. Jasmine nodded slowly. That's a risk I'll take. Ruth stared for a long moment, then leaned forward. Then may justice do the same. The clerk began reading from the first unsealed case. Dates, numbers, names. The echoes of forgotten people filled the room. Victims, whistleblowers, witnesses who'd vanished. Then came the bombshell, one name that made even Ruth flinch. File hashtag 9137B. Victim, Rebecca Hayes. The name hit Jasmine like a thunderclap. Her hands tightened on the table. That's her, Jasmine whispered. That's the woman I told you about. Ruth's eyes widened. This case was destroyed. I saw the records. No, Jasmine said, voice shaking. You saw the redacted copy. The real one was hidden. The clerk continued. Filed under RB Consulting, authorized by Senior Judge Ruth Bader. The courtroom gasped as Ruth froze. The initials, her initials, were there, printed clear as day. She went pale. That can't be. I never. Jasmine's voice was quiet. You didn't have to. Someone did it in your name. Ruth's breath hitched. Who? The answer came from behind. Me. Everyone turned. An elderly man stepped forward. Chief Judge Harold Mason, Ruth's mentor and old friend. His cane struck the floor with each step. His presence commanded silence. He looked straight at Ruth. You think you were protecting justice. But all these years, I was protecting you. Ruth's face twisted in disbelief. Protecting me? By burying the truth. I did what was necessary to keep this court alive, Mason said. The system can't survive if the people lose faith in it. So, I used your signature to close the Hayes case. To protect your career. To protect us. Jasmine's voice was sharp. You forged judicial approval? You silenced victims to save your own name. Mason glared at her. Don't talk to me about purity, young lady. This system runs on compromise. Idealists like you come and go, but the court must remain. Ruth stood slowly, anger shaking in her veins. At what cost, Harold? You turned justice into theater. Mason's tone softened. And you let me. The truth hit her like a punch. Ruth sank back into her chair, eyes glistening. All this time, I thought I was holding this system together, but maybe I was just holding it hostage. Jasmine spoke gently. It's not too late to let it go. Ruth looked up, tired, broken, but strangely free. Then let's finish what we started. The next hour unfolded like a reckoning. Ruth ordered every sealed case to be turned over to the Department of Justice. Mason was placed under investigation. Every clerk tied to the fund was suspended, and when it was over, Ruth stood for one final statement. Before I pronounce this court adjourned, I must make something clear, she began, voice trembling but strong. Justice is not a possession. It's a pursuit. And the moment you believe you own it, you become its enemy. She looked at Jasmine. I failed that pursuit. I let fear write my rulings. But today, I will not. She removed her judicial robe, folded it neatly on the desk. Effective immediately, I resign from this bench. The courtroom erupted. Reporters screamed. Jasmine froze, speechless. Ruth turned to her. You wanted truth, Ms. Crockett. Now it's yours. Don't waste it. As Ruth walked out, flashes blinded her, but she didn't flinch. Outside, the crowd that once chanted against her fell silent. For the first time in years, she wasn't the judge, she was just Ruth. Jasmine stepped outside moments later, and their eyes met briefly in the chaos. No words. Just a nod. Two women, once adversaries, now bound by a shared truth. That evening, the nation watched Ruth's resignation speech. If justice demands I stand down for it to rise, then so be it. It went viral instantly. People cried. Politicians squirmed. And for the first time in decades, Americans talked about justice not as entertainment, but as redemption. Jasmine received thousands of messages overnight, some calling her a hero, others calling her reckless. But one message stood out. A handwritten note slipped under her office door. Dear Ms. Crockett, you were right. Silence protects no one. Thank you for reminding me. R.B. She folded it gently, a small smile touching her lips. Weeks later, a new federal task force opened every case Jasmine fought for. The Hayes case became the cornerstone of reform. And as the final camera interview ended one evening, Jasmine looked at the reporter and said, "Justice doesn't die in darkness. It just waits for someone brave enough to strike the match."